We would be involved a full day in negotiations with the Japanese government, and the next day you get up in the morning and the front page of the Japanese newspaper has headlines about the very subject that you were discussing the day before.
Wow. Hi, I'm Shin Yamaguchi. Welcome to Dial in Japan, a brand new podcast where we'll connect with leaders in government, business, academia, civil society, and beyond. The goal of this podcast is to inspire dialogue and broaden perspectives on all things Japan. For this very first episode, I'm delighted to welcome Glen S. Fukushima. Glen is Vice Chair of the Securities Investor Protection Corporation, former Deputy Assistant United States Trade Representative for Japan and China, and former President of the American Chamber of Commerce in Japan. Glen, thank you for joining.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and congratulations on starting Dial in Japan.
Thanks, Glen. Glen, it's great to have you. I read your book on U.S.-Japan relations when I was a high school student here in Tokyo, and that had a huge impact on me. Ultimately inspired me to attend college in the States. And so I'm really glad that you're here for this inaugural episode of my podcast.
Well, thank you.
So some of our listeners are just beginning their careers. You worked at USTR, you were a business executive in Japan for many years, and also you've been deeply involved in the US-Japan space. Can you first take us through your career?
Well, sure. My father was a Japanese American, Nisei, second generation Japanese American, was born and raised in Los Angeles. And because he was in the US Army, he spent some of his time in Japan, also South Korea, and in the United States, mainly in California. So I grew up mainly in California and in Japan, but in Japan, most of my time there was on US military bases, so all my education was in English. But I did have experiences living in Japan when I was growing up. I went to elementary school and in California, in the San Francisco Bay Area, and then high school in Los Angeles. Junior high school years, I was in Japan at those U.S. International schools. And then I went to college at Deep Springs College, and then at Stanford. And then when I was a senior at Stanford, actually between my junior and senior year, I spent 1 year at Keio University in Japan. And then I went back to graduate from Stanford, then went back to Japan again and spent some time working at a newspaper company and law firm in Tokyo, also studied at Tokyo University, then went to graduate school at Harvard with the intention of getting a PhD and going into teaching. But after getting a master's degree and doing everything except my PhD in sociology, I concluded that academia really wasn't my cup of tea. And so I was wondering whether I should go to law school or business school, and I couldn't decide. So I went to a joint program of law and business at Harvard. So I actually spent 8 years altogether in graduate school at Harvard. And in retrospect, I think those were very good 8 years. I don't think that I at all regretted the fact that I had the luxury of spending those 8 years in graduate school at Harvard. In the meantime, my wife, who's from Japan, was teaching Japanese at Harvard for 6 years, and then got her master's degree in education. Later went on to get an MBA from Stanford. But so anyway, so we lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts for 8 years. I was a teaching fellow for Ezra Vogel, Edwin Reischauer, also David Riesman, who at that time was one of the leading American sociologists who wrote a very famous book called The Lonely Crowd in the 1950s. So those three professors I had the very good fortune of being a teaching fellow for at Harvard. And then in 1982, I finished, but I still didn't want to work. And so I got a Fulbright fellowship. And I spent a year at the University of Tokyo doing research on comparative U.S.-Japan antitrust law. And then came back to the States, practiced law in Los Angeles at Paul Hastings, Janowski & Walker. And then in 1985 was invited to join USTR, also the U.S. Trade Representative. So I went to Washington, worked for 5 years, took a huge salary cut, and was involved at the height of U.S.-Japan trade tensions. So I learned a great deal through that experience. Came to Japan once a month for trade negotiations, met lots of people in both the U.S. and in Japan, in politics, government, business, academia, journalism. Very, very intense 5 years. And then in 1990, I left USTR and joined AT&T. And after several months in AT&T headquarters in New Jersey,
Right.
I was assigned in Tokyo. And it was originally supposed to be a 3 to 5 year assignment,
Oh, really?
but ended up being 8 years with AT&T.
That's when I met you originally.
Yes.
Yeah,
And
remember.
then when I was getting ready to go back to the States, I was hired by Arthur D. Little, a management consulting firm, to head their Japan operations. And then after that, I was hired by Cadence Design Systems to work heading their Japan operations. And then I was head of NCR Corporation in Japan. And then my last job was to head the Japan operations of Airbus, the European aircraft manufacturer.
Sure.
And during that, the time that I was at AT&T and then with a couple of other American companies, I was the president of the American Chamber of Commerce in
Yes.
Japan. So very actively involved with other chambers,
Yes.
foreign chambers in Japan, and also with Keidanden, Keizaido Yukai, and so forth. And then in 2012, I had decided after 22 years that I should go back to the U.S. So I returned to Washington,
Yep.
joined the Center for American Progress, headed by John Podesta. 2016, I was working on Hillary Clinton's Asia Policy Working Group. And then in 2021, I was nominated to be vice chair of the Securities Investor Protection Corporation. So I've been doing that since that time. Recently, I've moved to Silicon Valley to do research on the relation between Silicon Valley and Japan, because I think there's a lot of interesting things that have gone on in the past, and also things we can probably look forward to in terms of cooperation between Silicon Valley and Japan. So just last week, I was at this week actually, I was at a conference in Osaka, the Osaka Expo.
Yeah, it's part of the expo, yeah.
Yeah, and so there's a global startup expo 2025 where several hundreds of people showed up to talk about startups and entrepreneurship and innovation in Japan. So
You're
that's
on
an
a
area that
panel
I'm
there.
very interested in pursuing. And so I moderated a panel discussion with former Prime Minister Kishida and President Fuji of Tokyo University. So over the next year or two, I plan to focus on that.
Yeah, fascinating. We'll come back to the question around startups, but I know initially when you were at Deep Springs, I was at Deep Springs, you went to Stanford, you wanted to be a doctor.
Right.
But you've been in U.S.-Japan relations for a long time. Was there a moment or experience where you realized, I'm going to be committing to U.S.-Japan relations long term?
Sure. Well, when I was growing up, because I had spent some time in Japan growing up on U.S. Army bases, and I had a lot of friends who were involved with Japan, I always thought of Japan as kind of a hobby, something that was part of my life, but not something I would necessarily pursue professionally. So, but I think it was actually during the 1 year that I was at Keio University from Stanford. There was a professor named Gerald Curtis who was had just gotten his PhD in 1969 at Columbia University, but he was ended up being one of the most prominent American scholars on Japanese politics. But he told me in 1971-72, when I was studying at Keio, that I took his seminar on U.S.-Japan relations, and he said, there actually aren't that many Americans who are seriously studying U.S.-Japan relations as an academic subject. And around that time, late 60s, early 70s, Japan was really, completely recovering from World War II, and it seemed like Japan was really actually going places. And so I thought, well, actually it might be interesting, since there are so few people who are Americans focused on Japan, and especially because Japanese language is so difficult for most Americans, that at that time, there weren't that many Americans who could read Japanese or speak Japanese.
Yeah, I mean, you're fluent in Japanese. I see you all the time on TV and radio, so yeah.
So I felt that, maybe I had some slight, edge in having grown up in both countries, and so I thought, well, maybe there is something, some potential there to focus on Japan as a subject of a professional pursuit. And that's what led me eventually, after going to Harvard, actually before going to Harvard, to want to become a professor to teach about Japan in the United States, but also maybe teach about the United States and Japan as well. But after being in academia for a while, I decided that I really, and I think it may is related to my experience at Deep Springs, where Deep Springs, as you know, is based on the three pillars of academic study, work, labor, and also democratic governance. And so I felt that if I were to become a professor, I would be primarily focused on just one of those three pillars, and just kind of the academic intellectual analysis, which is fine, and teaching and research, but I really wanted to do something. And so the theory and practice, I wanted to be able to combine the two. And that's what led me to go to business school and law school.
Understood. Just for our listeners, Deep Springs College is a small college of 26 students and 300 cows. Both Glen and I are graduates of the college, so do milking cows, irrigating, all
Very
of that.
unusual.
So that's what led you to USTR. So speaking of practice, as you mentioned, you were at USTR right around the height of U.S.-Japan trade tensions at the time. Tell us a little bit about that experience.
Sure. Well, it was a very exciting period because I would come to Japan once a month for trade negotiations, and we would be involved a full day in negotiation with the Japanese government, and the next day you get up in the morning and the front page of the Japanese newspapers has headlines about the very subject that you were discussing the day before. Wow. And so I would be busy from, say, 9 or 10 in the morning until 5 in the afternoon with the negotiations. Then after that, there would be meetings with Japanese officials, Japanese politicians, media people, academics, business people. So I would be out until past midnight and then go back to the hotel, get on the telephone, because in those days we didn't have emails. And so we were, actually we had emails internally at USJ, but not externally. So I would have to get on the telephone and talk to my colleagues in Washington, D.C. from, say, 1 o'clock in the morning till 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, go to sleep, get 3 hours of sleep, get up at 6, and then start in the morning with a breakfast meeting often with American business representatives, and then with the Japanese government again. And this would be for 5 or 6 days of the week that I was in Japan. So, and then back in Washington, because USTR had this unique role of being a coordinator of U.S. policy on trade, I chaired an interagency group consisting of about 12 government agencies, including Treasury and Commerce and Defense and Justice and Treasury and so forth, in which we would formulate trade policy towards Japan. And then our group would report to the TPRG, Trade Policy Review Group, which is an interagency undersecretary level group. And then they would report to the EPG, the Economic Policy Group, which was the cabinet level group.
Oh, gotcha.
And so there was a real sense of excitement and a sense of purpose, because we were doing things that were very important in terms of the future of American industry and American economy. And so in those days, even in the United States, people like Tom Friedman and other very high-profile, prominent journalists who would be calling on us to find out what's going on U.S.-Japan trade.
And some of the key issues that you discussed at the time?
When we would meet for the U.S.-Japan Trade Committee meetings once every few months, we had a list of 35 topics, but among the most prominent topics were semiconductors, supercomputers, telecommunications, automobiles, automobile parts, soda ash, legal services, financial services, agricultural products, beef and citrus. And so there was just a whole plethora of issues. Pharmaceuticals was another one. It was just a whole range. There were so many American companies that wanted to do business with Japan or in Japan, and many of them were having difficulties getting into the Japanese market.
Because it was the first time, so...
Well, yeah, so what was interesting was that there would be all these American companies that would be coming to USTR to say, our company is successful in the United States and in Europe and Latin America and the Middle East and other parts of Asia, every place in the world except Japan. And so, and when we investigated, often that was the case, and there were a number of different reasons why that may have been the case. In some cases, it was that those American companies weren't doing enough, or sometimes they were doing enough, but there were barriers in Japan. There were, multiple levels of difficulties that they encountered. Some were government related, some were private sector related, some were psychological. So it was really interesting from a standpoint of the profession of a trade negotiator and trying to get access to the Japanese market, but intellectually, I mean, for instance, one example is the legal services issue. You know, Japanese lawyers would come to the United States, take the bar examination in New York or California, and in those days, I don't know what it is now, but in those days, California had the most difficult bar exam in the U.S. Even there, the passing rate was something like 60%. Whereas in Japan, at that time, the passing rate for the Japanese legal bar exam was about less than 2%. And so, as you know, there are people in Japan who spend years and years taking the bar exam to get in, to become an attorney in Japan. And at that time, there were only about 13,000 bengoshi in Japan. There were about 900,000 lawyers in the United States, because the functions are quite different, as you know. And so anyway, having studied at Tokyo University Law Department, having worked at a Japanese law firm, having worked at an American law firm, I could understand the differences between the American and Japanese legal systems and what needed to be done to make the adjustments so that the American attorneys and other foreign attorneys who wanted to work in Japan could work in Japan, but they wouldn't have to go through the process of taking the Japanese bar exam, which very, very few people who are not Japanese could pass.
Yeah. Let's talk, and you were at USTR for 5 years, and then you came back to Japan in capacity as a business executive at various U.S. and Japan, European headquartered companies. Can you talk a little bit about U.S.-Japan relations and how Japan has been perceived by the international community over the years from that time up to the present? You've been involved in various capacities in that regard.
So certainly since the 1970s, when late 60s, early 70s, when I got involved with Japan as a student, there's been a lot of ups and downs. And you know, I would say from the late 60s into the 70s, and 1979 was when Ezra Vogel published Japan as #1 Lessons for America. So I would say from about 1975 to 1995, that 20-year period was a period when Japan was considered to be a powerful economic rival of the United States. And in fact, some people in the United States were afraid that Japan was going to overtake the United States economically. And I think in 1989 I think there was a public opinion poll asking the American public between the Soviet military challenge and the Japanese economic challenge, which is a bigger threat to America. And 68% of the American public said that the Japanese economic challenge was a bigger threat to America. And 22% said that they were about the same. So that just kind of shows that it's almost it's hard to believe, I think, at this point, that Japan, in those days, back in the 1970s, 80s, was considered such a powerful economic rival of the United States. So for a while, between the 75 to 95 timeframe, I'd say that Japan was considered, many people respected Japan, admired Japan, feared Japan, but Japan was always in the news. When I was at USTR, 85 to 90, I'd say that although the U.S. trade representative was supposed to be dealing with all of our trading partners, actually that person, the U.S. trade representative, spent probably 50 or 60% of his time or her time on Japan, because that was, when you said trade in Washington, that Japan was the main topic of conversation. So, and then, in the early 90s, the Japanese bubble burst, and then I would say from about the mid-90s, partly because the Japanese economy was facing challenges, but also the U.S. economy was really picking up. That was the other factor too. I think in 1992, during the presidential election, "It's the economy, stupid," was the slogan, and Bill Clinton won against George Bush and Ross Perot in large part because there was such dissatisfaction with how the Bush administration was dealing with economic policy in the United States. And after Clinton became president, actually the U.S. economy did extremely well in terms of growth rate, unemployment was low, budget deficit was eliminated. And so that success of the U.S. economy, I think, gave the U.S. confidence. And therefore, the focus on Japan shifted away from the trade conflicts more to security issues. And so in 1995, in particular, with the North Korea nuclear issue and missile issue, and with tensions in Taiwan Straits, and also with difficulties with the U.S. forces in Okinawa in September of 1995, those issues shifted the United States away from economic and trade issues to security issues. And so, and then again in the 1990s, there was a resurgence of economic and business issues during the Clinton administration with the framework talks, but that subsided. And as I say, the security issues came to the fore. And then until recently, I'd say that the economic issues with Japan had pretty much taken a back seat to the security issues. But I think now with the second Trump administration, there's a revival of a focus by the United States on economic issues and trade imbalance issues and so forth with Japan. So, we've seen, a lot of ups and downs, and I guess, in some ways you can say it's kind of a cycle of attention to Japan on economic issues and security issues.
It's very helpful, the framework of looking at the economic security issue and the national security issue.
Right.
So, yeah. Now, big picture, Japan is a major industrialized country, but at the same time, it is different, distinct in various ways, whether it be from a policy perspective or a cultural perspective. Can you talk a little bit about how Japan might compare to the U.S. or Europe in that regard?
Sure.
You've worked in the U.S., you worked for European corporations, you lived in Japan for a long time.
Well, if you look at like the G7 countries, right? Yeah. Japan is the only non-Western country of the G7 countries, right. And I think that has some real meaning in the sense that although Japan is either the number 4 or number 5, it used to be the number 2 country in terms of GDP. In the world, and technologically, it's certainly a very advanced country. There are, historical and social and cultural aspects of Japan that make it quite distinct from other G7 countries. Right. And if you look at, one measure might be corporate governance. Until maybe say 30 years ago, most Japanese companies had either no or very few outside board members. And even if they did have outside board members, usually they were Japanese males. And so corporate board memberships, there was a huge difference between the United States on the one hand and Japan on the other. And over the last 20 to 30 years, there's been a lot of changes on the Japanese side in particular, so that now there are more outside board members and there are more women, and in some cases, some non-Japanese who become members of Japanese boards. And yet, if you compare the U.S. and Japan, among the G7 countries, they are still polar opposites in the sense that Britain is generally relatively close to the U.S. And then there's France, Germany, Italy, Canada. But among the G7 countries, Japan and the U.S. really are the extremes.
There have been many studies and books on this.
Oh yeah, lots and lots of books. And there's just lots of examples where on the surface, the U.S.-Japan look very similar, but underneath the surface, the way things are done in Japan can be quite different. And it's not that one is better than the other, but they can be quite different. And I think that it does require a certain level of patience and understanding and often language ability to be able to understand what beneath the surface may be quite different, although on the surface it may appear similar.
On the corporate governance point, I know you speak from experience, and you were on the board of a major Japanese financial institution. Your wife also has been the first woman on many of these Japanese corporations. So, speaking of Japan, let's dig a little deeper on the business side. When you were here as a business executive, you worked with many large Japanese corporations. Can you talk a little bit about some of the characteristics that you observed there? Sure. In your interactions with your counterparties?
Well, I was here at a certain time, 1990 to 2012, so it's a while back, and also most of my customers were corporate customers.
Sure.
So I wasn't dealing with the mass consumer market.
Right.
But I did talk with lots of friends, and colleagues who were part of the American Chamber who did have customers, individual customers rather than corporate institutional customers. I think the takeaway that I had based on my experience was that, our Japanese customers and partners, by and large, although there are exceptions, tend to value continuity, stability, predictability, and they put a great deal of emphasis on precedence, what happened before. So if something had been done before, then it was likely to be approved to be done again. But if there had not been a precedent, then it would be often very difficult to get a Japanese company to do something for the first time without a precedent. And also, as is often said, Japanese companies tend to think in the longer term than many American companies, although there are some exceptions, on the American company side. And as is often said, American companies often put the emphasis on transactions, and Japanese companies more on long-term relationships. And there are obviously exceptions on both sides in the U.S. Japan, but generally speaking, those held true while I was working as the head of American companies operating in Japan. Another major difference I felt was the personnel system, where I was working for one American company in which, in the spring and in the fall, we would do a personnel evaluation, and the personnel evaluation would be global. In every country in the world, we would use the same instrument to measure performance, 360-degree review and so forth. And the policy of this company in the United States headquarters was the top 20% get bonuses, the bottom 20% are fired. And that was the policy in the US, and they expected us to follow that policy in Japan. In Japan, it's rather difficult, especially if the company's doing really well. I mean, this company was doing very well, a very profitable company, that every year we would try to get 20% of the employees to leave the company because their performance wasn't what headquarters expected. So that was a battle I had with headquarters all the time about how that's not the way things are done in Japan. And if we were to get rid of 20% simply because they weren't performing as well as the other 80%, that would make it very difficult for us to hire people in the future. But so that's another area where, things like, I was on several Japanese corporate boards, and in those days, I often attended board meetings without a single mention of share price of the company, which would be unthinkable in the United States. So things like emphasis on share price, also how long-term you think, also about long-term relationships, and about personnel policy. Those are all issues where I felt there were significant differences between the American companies that I was representing and the Japanese companies that were clients or customers or partners.
Interesting. And also, I think when you look at Japanese business, you have large corporations, you have small, medium enterprises, you have family-run organizations, companies, and then you have startups, as we discussed earlier in this podcast, that are the momentum is growing around that area as well. And in terms of Japanese businesses, given the global business environment, innovation, AI, supply chain, all these issues Japanese companies have to address in some capacity. So in that regard, I think some things are changing.
Oh yeah, no, I think there's been a lot of change, and I think that there's much more diversity among Japanese companies. As you say, the large traditional corporates, they tend not to change so quickly, but there is a tremendous amount of diversity, and there's some of the companies that have started in the last, say, 10, 20, 30 years. They often are, quite global and quite agile and adaptable and move very quickly. And so, yeah, there's a lot more diversity than there used to be, I think, in the Japanese corporate world.
Sure. Let's switch over to education. You've been focusing your philanthropic efforts in the education space over the past few years. What's driving you, and what's your kind of thinking in terms of how the younger generation should take advantage of their educational opportunities?
Well, maybe it's because I spent a lot of time in school. I mean, for 3 years at Stanford, 1 year at Keio, and then 1 year at Deep Springs, and then also then 8 years at Harvard, and then let's see, 1 year at Keio, 2 years at Tokyo University. So I think myself that education is quite important, and education at every level is important, but especially in my case, I have tended to focus on higher education. And so I made some contributions to American institutions, Japanese institutions, and also things like the Fulbright program of exchanging of students and researchers and professors between the two countries. Also the Japan-American Student Conference, which is a conference begun in 1934.
Where you met your wife.
That's right, where I met my wife, and which promotes student exchanges on the undergraduate and graduate level. And I think for the future, whether we think about politics or economics or the environment or health and welfare, pandemics, natural disasters, whatever the topic is, I think having an educated professional workforce that can deal with those issues, not only domestically but also internationally and cooperating with other countries, I mean, that I think is very, very important. And so it's with that in mind that I have devoted some of my philanthropic contributions to the educational sphere. In the past, I was making contributions to museums and to music organizations and political activities, and I think those are all I still think important. But I think education is really the pillar that I think is so important that I plan in the future as well to spend considerable attention to.
Yeah, I think to your point that many of the emerging issues globally require a kind of a multi-country, multi-region, multi-disciplined approach, and so I think I totally agree with you that studying abroad or expanding your horizons in a way that you can collaborate with folks from other disciplines or other cultures, other countries is going to be critical as we as a society address some of these issues.
Yeah. And with Japan in particular, and I am, as you know, I've been concerned that back in the 1997, the peak was that more than 47,000 Japanese students were studying at least for a year in the United States at the college level. And it's dropped from number 1 to, I think, number 11. And now there are only about 11,000 Japanese studying in the United States. And, at one point there were 390,000 Chinese and, India, Taiwan, Korea, Vietnam, I think Canada, Saudi Arabia, Nigeria. Many other countries have more students in the United States than Japan and studying in the United States. And I think that, I don't want to limit it only to the United States, but just the notion of Japanese students studying abroad, I think that's something I think is very important, and I'd like to help promote that as well.
Thank you so much for all your contributions in various ways. As we wrap up, this is incredibly insightful. Do you have any final thoughts that you would like to share with our listeners?
Well, I suppose what we've talked about, the importance of education, and especially about young people having exposure to other countries is very important. And I think you, in many ways, learn more about your own country by spending time abroad because you have some reference point to compare with.
Yes.
So that I think is very important. And I think the importance of U.S.-Japan relations, although we talked about the fact that there have been ups and downs and many cycles in the U.S.-Japan relationship, I think it's still the case that economically, scientifically, politically, in terms of military, security, defense, the U.S.-Japan have a lot to offer each other for cooperation and for mutual learning. So I do think that it's important that we focus on the importance of the relationship and making sure that the relationship will go in a positive direction and we can continue and expand the cooperation.
Absolutely. I think you've been deeply involved in U.S.-Japan relations for
And I'm
many
hoping
years.
for your
Hopefully,
generation
to
as well
follow
to continue.
will do the same. So thank you again, Glenn, for joining us for this inaugural episode, and hope we can continue this dialogue going
Well, thank you very
forward.
much for inviting me. And again, congratulations on starting Japan Dial-In.
Yeah, I couldn't have imagined this when I was reading your book back in high school, but here we are. So
Right, great.
So thank you for tuning in today. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe. And we'll be back next month with the next edition of Dial in Japan. Bye.